Great. So the first of the two hubs that I'm going to talk about today is the Pennsylvania-based hub. And I do want to draw some distinctions between these two proposals, but also highlight the similarities in that each hub is anchored and sponsored by a different state, Pennsylvania and West Virginia primarily, though other state governments are involved as well. But one thing that the hubs do have in common is that one, they both primarily feature blue hydrogen, so fossil fuel-based hydrogen production. And then the other thing is that despite being primarily led by one state, they have pretty expansive footprints in terms of their geographic expansion. So so I think in shorthand I might refer to one as the Pennsylvania or the West Virginia hub, but just keep that in mind. So first, the DNA hub in Pennsylvania. The two lead, working on the technical side of the application and the process and implementation are Shell and Mitsubishi Power Americas. Team Pennsylvania has also been working on the application itself and has kind of been leading that process and doing some of the cursory stakeholder engagement that they've done to date. Other things to be aware of, they envision a 30-county region, significantly smaller than one West Virginia envisions, but still a pretty large scope of area, based in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, with anchor projects primarily in western Pennsylvania, and then one being the Shell plant, and then less details about what other projects would be, but from what we've gathered, it does seem that power generation seems to be a big focus for them. One of the earlier partners, Equinor, Norwegian oil energy carbon capture company, was again originally one of the lead applicants or lead partners in this application process, but dropped out earlier this year, likely because they wanted to pivot their investments to carbon capture projects in the Gulf. So just something to be aware of there. And then another kind of late stage change for this process, and wanting to note this in particular because I do feel like this was prominent in the way that this project was talked about and some of the reporting, but wanting to highlight the potential for more beneficial uses through steel production, things like that. Unfortunately, it does not seem to be that's going to be an emphasis of the project in the near term. It's something that they're considering later on, and this is best reflected by the fact that U.S. Steel has since dropped out of the project. Great, and again, multiple hydrogen production facilities. Blue hydrogens are requiring a substantial amount of carbon capture infrastructure, and focusing that around industrial clusters and power plants. And for people who haven't seen it, this is a really interesting, kind of highlights magazine version, I guess, of what they intend to do. And you see, a lot of what I talked about. I'm going to try this pointer thing to see how it works. So we have the gas production, we have the carbon capture. Is kind of underlying all these projects. Hypothetically, some steel production in the future. TBD manufacturing, power generation, and then of course the Shell polymer plant in NACA. And then way over here is community benefits, and I'll be talking about that later on. And then the last thing I want to mention about this project, and this wraps up almost everything I know about it. The rest I have is speculation and things I've kind of heard indirectly, but just to give people a little bit more just information about what priority area might be. I wanted to mention that there was a piece in the 2022-2023 Pennsylvania capital budget that identified a number of western Pennsylvania counties as places where they might be pursuing additional gas and hydrogen development. So wanted to give people more of a scope of what this might look like in the region. And then moving on to the second hub, the Appalachian Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub, ARCH2. Again, still looking at kind of that Central Appalachian, Ohio River Valley, tri-state and Kentucky region, but I think a significantly larger area than Pennsylvania. Their footprint spans 118 counties. Obviously, the largest footprint is in West Virginia, but you also note other areas with 3 projects in Ohio, Western Pennsylvania. One of the main projects is Clinton County. I'll talk about that a little later on. And again, kind of keep Sean's presentation in the back of your mind. One of the other kind of distinctions here to draw is that while Pennsylvania has, I think, a much more focused plan in terms of their target customer base, power generation and industrial facilities. Arch 2, I think, has a much more expansive vision for uses of hydrogen, and I think that is also reflected very clearly in the scope of projects that have been disclosed to date. So power generation, industrial, commercial, and even residential, I think that is, to me, very speculative. We'll see what happens there. And then transportation, another, I think, place where we've seen a lot of reluctance for adoption. And then I also want to note, I try to contextualize this as much as I can because, I think, without that context, it is a little alarming to see, just the region kind of lit up like a Christmas tree. But, I also want to note that they also fail to define what a project is, right? And so, this term could refer to facilities of a variety of sizes, levels of impact, and viability, right? And, I think, again, to kind of Sean's earlier point, I think it remains an open question, how much of this will be built, right? How much of it will ultimately be operational at all. So keep that in mind as you look at that. Also want to highlight some of the people, some of the kind of like anchor institutions that are leading the application process in West Virginia. Most prominently, we have Patel that's doing a lot of the technical stuff, Allegheny Science and Technology that is ostensibly leading the community benefits process, and then EQT is also involved. But a number of, there's kind of an ecology of like labor, industry, and higher ed that is kind of formed around this initiative. And I'll be talking a little bit about that as well because I think this is, there's a lot here. A few other, I'm not going to be covering, too much of this, frankly, because again, this is just something that we don't have a lot of information of, but wanted to, share these two graphics, that were included in a recent presentation from Arch 2 to get a sense again of the kind of geographic priority and scope of the projects. We're starting to see some of the earlier job estimates. Again, take that with a grain of salt. And then, of course, starting to see, where we might see some of the kind of hubs of, some of the areas where we'll see potentially, at least, based on their intent, increased hydrogen production activity. And you can also get a sense of, who might be involved and where down here. So this is the Pennsylvania project I mentioned early on. A few of these have been announced. We're still waiting to hear about what's going on with Hope Gas and Plug and Clearway. And then this one in Kentucky, and then a whole host of projects in Ohio that we don't have any information about. But again, just to give you a sense of where these are. And we also want to, or I also want to put, some of these numbers into context, right? For a variety of reasons. The majority of these jobs, would be, primarily, located in, kind of temporary construction center. So a very short-term injection of employment. And a good example of this is one of the projects that has been announced is an ammonia facility in southern West Virginia that projects 2,000 construction jobs, but only a couple hundred permanent jobs. And this same pattern where we see this kind of large injection of these short-term employment opportunities, and then very few jobs that kind of remain ongoing or permanently, is also reflected in the Fidelis project as well. So we'll see about that a little later on. And then just more clearly, you can get a sense of who these partners are. And I want to draw a distinction between this set of entities and the groups mentioned or referenced early on. Again, kind of this broader ecology of support. This set of organizations are the entities that are going to be leading development of specific projects. And as best as I can tell, there are 15 different projects that are being developed by these different groups, and we have a sense of maybe I think 5 of them at this point, but still much more information to glean. And it goes without saying, Arch 2 partners that primarily consist of hydrogen producers, oil and gas companies, and potential end users. And then, of course, the 5 that I'll be covering shortly are being developed by groups on this, or by entities on this list. So I mentioned earlier the Atmospheric Energy facility. So this is in Gilbert Creek, West Virginia, and southern West Virginia, and it is primarily focused on there are 2 components. So it's going to be producing blue hydrogen, which is ammonia that's produced, with carbon capture, and so from hydrogen, and so compared to say like so-called gray ammonia and green hydrogen, or sorry, green ammonia, right? So kind of paralleling the same color scheme with hydrogen. And again, a pretty significant production goal here, 2.16 million tons of blue ammonia each year. Something I guess to be aware of is that out of all the uses that have been proposed, at least from my reading, ammonia, I think is, one of the more mature, and I hesitate to say safer region, because why would people pay more for clean hydrogen when, companies can already just buy dirty hydrogen? There's no external incentive for them to do that. But just want to mention that, they are primarily targeting agriculture industry. This is a very well-established, end use for ammonia. But again, not a lot of the blue ammonia happening in the country. And I also wanted to mention, kind of put this into context. This is, I think, the largest, it's one of the largest in the world if built, and then also the largest in the country, if it does move into operations and built. There's another pretty large one in the Gulf that has about half the capacity of this one. And there's another separate project, but that again had half the capacity, and it was being developed by I think Nutrien, Canadian company in the Gulf, and they actually recently shelved their plans to move ahead with their blue ammonia project. They suspended it indefinitely, primarily because of the uncertainty, for where are they going to find customers to take advantage of, their blue ammonia, and so just wanted to put that into perspective, the other high blue ammonia project that I mentioned in the Gulf is it's being developed by CF Industries, and their primary target is they're really targeting overseas market and apparently Asia, where again there is this adoption and there are these incentives, for companies to avail themselves of cleaner hydrogen, cleaner ammonia. But last I checked, I don't think West Virginia has a seaport. And then again, we have the 2,000 jobs projected during construction, 200 permanent jobs, pretty significant cost involved. I think that will be an important figure to track. As seen in one of the later projects, that cost is already kind of coming up. We're already experiencing some of these timelines being pushed back. And then just highlighting a little bit of some of this kind of like regulatory or incentivizing infrastructure that's kind of in place of clearing the landscape for these projects. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this one because this is, I think, all of the information I have about it. So this is, another one of the ARCH2 anchor projects located in Ballensby, West Virginia, and it seems to be some sort of pyrolysis plant that will incorporate hydrogen in some way. Unclear, how the specifics of the pyrolysis, their waste to fuels chemical recycling project, and again where and how hydrogen will factor into it. But just to be aware of this, and this is also kind of happening, against a backdrop of I think other kind of like a broader pyrolysis effort, in particularly West Virginia, but I think in the region as a whole. So, and then here's an interesting one, between Chemours and TC Energy, where we have an industrial user and a hydrogen producer who have partnered together. And so they have, some commitment to work with each other, where Chemours will be producing hydrogen that TC Energy uses at their chemical manufacturing plant. We've already done some testing. And one of the things I guess to also be aware of is, how clean the hydrogen is really depends on, how it's produced, right? And this is even true for the electrolysis base. And so they provided no details regarding the source of electricity, and there's kind of a whole universe of ways that they could be producing that electricity that I think results in a differential of carbon dioxide emissions. So and then here's one in Pennsylvania. This is the Key State project in Clinton County, and so yeah, this one I think has been kind of hard to pin down for anyone that's been keeping track of Key State and the people involved, but from where it seems to be landing, it does seem like they are going to be utilizing a pretty large piece of property in central Pennsylvania for carbon storage, and then having the associated hydrogen production as well. And I don't know, just from all the interviews I read about this project and the people involved, I feel like they'll say yes to anything. One of the firm committed or previously committed customers was Nikola, which is kind of I think now a very struggling and controversial fuel cell truck manufacturer that's had a number of legal issues and financial issues as well. And so I don't think they're listed on the website anymore, but no affirmative statement has been made regarding a change in their relationship. So just wanted to mention that that is one of their customers. And again, we're seeing that kind of gap between short-term jobs and permanent jobs. And originally was intended to start in 2026 and has been pushed back to 27 or 28. And then the last one I'll talk about is the Fidelis project that Sean referenced earlier. I'll be spending a little bit more time in the second presentation talking about this, but the top lines here are that this involves a very small biomass fuel power plant, a much larger hydrogen production facility, and a pretty significant carbon capture project that is intended to anchor decades of carbon sequestration for a variety of customers in West Virginia. Something they're hoping to attract new industry and new companies to locate on their site and avail themselves of this carbon sequestration capacity. And an example of this is that they're also targeting data centers. They have a separate data center that's kind of in the works. Again, a lot of questions involved about how this will actually happen, whether there really is that interest, whether they're going to be able to get these new customers and so on. So those are all the projects that we have today. I think this one's really important to take note of. I'm going to be spending some time talking about kind of the political and regulatory effort that I think has helped create this project, right? Because I think it's really indicative of just the way that these projects have been designed, and I think how there are insufficient guardrails in both the program themselves and also in the implementation to ensure that the projects are successful even on their own terms, right? Cool. So, and that's a good segue to my next section. I want to talk a little bit about challenges with hydrogen hub implementation. And so, just to kind of give you kind of a guiding framework for my, the themes of my presentation, really want to highlight, where we've seen insufficient interagency coordination and what that has meant for projects on the ground. I want to highlight, the direct and indirect ways that policymakers have externalized the responsibility, right? Treating the economic and political landscape that these projects are, developing on as if it's just like a natural fact of life, right? As if, there's nothing that we can do about it, right? And it's someone else's problem. And then also just wanted to reference the lack of a coherent engagement strategy that has significantly put the public at a disadvantage. And then seeing how this disorganized, selectively passive, and scattered decarbonization policy is limiting the success of the projects, both in terms of what people in the region I think want, and also what the people who design these policies are trying to achieve. So first, I want to highlight just kind of three kind of core early decisions that I think are a good example of this kind of passive, hands-off approach, but have also, I think, helped set the DNA and the momentum of these projects. So two important things to be aware of are the design of the funding opportunity announcement, and so this is the mechanism that the Department of Energy has used, to outline their goals for the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub program. And so there's a variety of rules and just design choices made in this document that I think encourage and discourage particular behavior from applicants and set some expectations with the public and so on. And some of this is, I think, congressionally determined, and these two in particular, I do want to. The feedstock diversity here requires that, and this is more or less the language directly from, from the federal legislation that created this program, that has more or less kind of made its way wholesale into the funding opportunity announcement, where, quote, to the maximum extent practical, right? And so, to me, I read a lot of discretion there, right? Not a hard, strict requirement, but, as much as possible, at least one hub each that's powered by renewable energy, nuclear energy, and from hydrogen produced from fossil fuels. And I wanted to highlight this in particular because, to me, this reflects a choice, and, I do feel that, a failure to make a choice on the part of federal policymakers is an active choice. And so, rather than, set more affirmative guidance for, like we want to see 50% of these projects renewable, or, or setting, limits on the number of fossil fuels or conditions on nuclear, et cetera, they, again, kind of kept the language wholesale, from the legislation, right? And what that has resulted in is in a landscape where, based on analysis from IEFA and resources from the future, only a quarter of the confirmed hydrogen hub applications are based solely on clean energy, or hydrogen produced from clean energy, right? The rest are a mix of, obviously heavy fossil fuels, but also some nuclear, or a mix of both of those with renewable energy. And so I just wanted to, I think draw a connection between, the way that this program was designed and, kind of the signals that it has sent to the industry and to potential applicants. And then similarly, this is more of a, I think, kind of strict one, but wanting to see, the intention was wanting to have at least 2 hubs built in places where they have significant natural gas resources, and I think our region is a good example of one of those, right? And then, I think to me, like, what this represents is, again, there are ways for the DOE could have managed this or, set its own intentions, or actually made it. I'm not even quite sure what the intentions of the DOE, are in the FOA, and I've read it twice, but, there's a lot of signals that you can get from that document and from the National Hydrogen Roadmap, but to me, I just see so many examples of them just kind of leaving it at the chance, right? Leaving it up to either the market, the applicants, state, local officials, et cetera, and then, apparently just being content with whatever comes out of that process. And so again, just wanted to highlight these 2 decisions as examples where, rather than take kind of an affirmative approach in setting the tone of this project, they've kind of let things play out very naturally. And, I think that is one of the reasons we're seeing hydrogen applications that, are directly connected to the kind of development that the region has seen for decades. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but I thought Sean would get this would be a nice treat for Sean. Also wanted to flag that, again, thinking about kind of the inherent choices, they're kind of setting the tone for these projects. Wanted to bring back a report last year from the Government Accountability Office that found that the DOE's management of its prior carbon management projects had increased risk for the public and wasted $500 million on facilities that were never built. And one of the reasons I'm going to bring it up here is that some of the issues that the GAO identified in that process was the volatility of the fossil fuel industry, the uncertainty regarding carbon markets, and then project costs that were higher than expected, all issues that are also reflective of the challenges and barriers to the hydrogen hub development that is being pursued regardless, right? And so having this very real world case study and what development is needed, the decisions that policymakers can make to encourage and discourage particular things, and then also I think the structural challenges, I think that extent to blue hydrogen production, we see more of the same, right? So just wanted to highlight this report for anyone who hasn't seen it. I really like this headline from the Government Accountability Office on the right. All right, wanted to say a little bit more about interagency coordination because again, I think this is also a good example of how again, rather than take kind of a centralized, affirmative, proactive, hands-on approach, that I think helps contextualize and provide a container for a variety of different initiatives at the federal level, again, we're kind of seeing this approach where it's like whatever happens, happens. And so a few examples of that, looking at the, for example, so I mentioned that there's this regional clean hydrogen hub program that's advancing as seen through that funding opportunity announcement. And, when that program was opened up, the feds didn't even have a definition for what clean hydrogen was. And they were still developing. That standard was released as a draft alongside that FOA, but it was not finalized until well into, the implementation of that project. And in the middle of the DOE reviewing and providing feedback to, the applicants that made it to that second stage, right? And so again, I think, had that been, set and firm, I think on one hand it would have provided, I think, some important clarity for, for industry and, applicants, right, about what kind of projects might make sense for them to, pursue, right? And also how, the definition of clean hydrogen will be, assessed by policymakers, right? But again, it's just an example of, rather than, I think, provide that clarity, rather than, have that, kind of in the DNA of the project. It was kind of just left as a separate, unrelated thing, right? That obviously has direct consequences on how this is going to be, implemented in the future. And, we have seen, I think the 45V hydrogen production tax credit is another good example of this, where, it's been a year. I think it was like a week or two that the IRS was supposed to finalize that, the guidance for the use of that tax credit, and has failed to do so. I think it might be that they're using like the year deadline from when they submitted their like opportunity rather than when the bill was passed, but whatever. And so I wanted to highlight this in particular because, it does seem that one of the effects of this has been that, because there's, no real clarity around what constitutes clean hydrogen, and certainly no formal guidance for what, the differential of incentives for different kinds or different scales of like so-called clean hydrogen. We're seeing more and more, we're seeing that a lot of the projects that are being proposed, and obviously seeing, kind of the impact of the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub program, at least used towards blue hydrogen, right? And we're also seeing a lot of these companies availing themselves, or intending to avail themselves of the 45Q carbon sequestration tax credit, rather than the 45V for a variety of reasons, right? So again, just wanted to highlight how that decision has, led to, what we're seeing on the ground, right? And again, just to kind of summarize, there's a significant need for the Department of Energy, IRS, and certainly the EPA to be coordinating effectively over what the federal government's goals are in terms of decarbonization, in terms of environmental justice and community benefits. And the fact that Class 6 primacy efforts, where the EPA is deciding which states should or shouldn't be receiving primary management over the carbon sequestration, carbon injection permits. The fact that that's moving independent of this process, and there are examples of that friction. Whether you're a community and EJ stakeholder, or whether you're Joe Manchin, right? Or a number of industry leaders who are like I think are pretty irate that they're trying to advance particular projects, but the lack of clarity and certainty about what the regulatory landscape will be, I think again is in one sense kind of a failure to make a decision, but that to me I think is kind of a decision, right? And so just a little bit more about the Class 6 primacy process. I wanted to highlight a letter that the EPA Administrator Michael Reagan sent to state governors last year, outlining their and then the Biden-Harris administration's priorities regarding state primacy, right? States achieving primary management of these carbon injection wells. And in addition to reaffirming that they're committed to supporting states' efforts to secure primacy, they also want to see state leaders implement an inclusive public participation process, consider EJ, enforce the protections, which I don't understand. That's not an elective thing. That's I think how primacy works, and so it's telling me to see that it's in there. And then try to identify some other measures that they can use to strengthen the protections at the state level, right? What we've seen instead, we're seeing primacy advance, in a context where, we have West Virginia officials stating that they actually lack the authority to enforce environmental justice. And that is something that, should give the Biden-Harris administration pause, something that should give the EPA pause, right? And instead, that process is moving along. We've also seen, I do want to note that Pennsylvania does, does have, kind of an EJ engagement policy, right, and, has an office of EJ and so on, right, but, the practical outcome of the state's pursuit of Class 6 primacy is that, they prioritize expediency over transparency and engagement. And so even just and so they're advancing this process just 3 months after that EPA letter was sent to state governors, and, for people who aren't tracking that, there was like a state advisory meeting where a state official just casually remarked that the state was considering looking at, applying for, primacy over the Class 6 wells, or maybe the full suite of underground injection control programs, because Pennsylvania doesn't have primary management over any of those programs. And then 3 days later, they submitted a letter of intent to the EPA saying, hey, we want to check this out. We're interested in receiving federal funds, to explore this, right? And nowhere in that process was there any, moment where they kind of took a step back and said, hey, is this in the public's interest? Should we talk to people, right? What is the EPA telling me in terms of their expectations, right? And, are my actions aligning with those expectations, right? 2 other examples of that, looking at, that we have, significant issues with, existing issues with state management of Class 2 injection wells in Ohio and West Virginia that raise questions about those states' ability to properly manage this much more complicated, much, in a program with much more unknowns, right? Again, something that I think seems very out of step with what the EPA is putting in writing versus what's actually happening, right? And I think a really good example of that as well is, seeing that at least in, Pennsylvania and in West Virginia, that was passed last year, and in, Pennsylvania, legislators are also exploring this, but liability waivers for these storage projects, and this is happening in a landscape that's already significantly burdened by legacy issues from the fossil fuel industry. And, again, no real interrogation of, is this in the interest of the public and the environment, right? What are we doing to address these existing issues? Are we really in a position to create more? And then again, right, are we, do these actions align with what the EPA says is, the character of their primacy process, right? So just as a reminder. Also, an example of, again, kind of the lack of interagency coordination is the prior misuse of the 45Q tax credit. And so in the first 10 years of the existence of this tax credit, almost all of the, from an IRS investigation, almost all of the $1 billion claimed, for that tax credit, was improper, right? And, I think the kind of like material issue at heart is that, these companies fail to have a monitoring, reporting, and verification plan in place, right? And so they should have never been able to receive this tax credit because they can't demonstrate that they're actually storing the carbon to begin with, right? And again, an example where the EPA and the IRS aren't talking to each other, or maybe it's someone else's job, or maybe there was a gap in communication, right? But has created a situation where ultimately 59% of those credits, more than half, were revoked following enforcement action from the IRS. And again, I do think that I don't think that this has been part of the 45Q reporting, and I think it's very essential to telling the story, because I think it really highlights, again, some of these gaps in implementation, the risks involved. I do understand that there are some steps, that they're interested in taking some steps to address this and preclude this from happening in the future. But just to kind of put this, put that risk in context, where in the first 10 years, there was about $1 billion of this tax credit was utilized, and then between 2022 and 2032, that number goes up to 30 billion, right? So which again, I think is a really good indicator of both the the volume of carbon storage that I think either policymakers or industry officials or industry leaders are intending, as well as the associated cost to the public in terms of tax dollars. So again, wanted to highlight this, I think, an example of the interagency coordination that isn't happening, right? Next, I want to talk about stakeholders and benefits. And I think, sorry, I'd love to hear what some of the other people in the room have to think about this one, and I guess we'll hear about that later on. But I think based on both the written design of these programs and what I've seen on the ground, it's clear to me that the implementation of the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub program prioritizes applicants, not the public or impacted communities, right? And you can look at all the commitments that they make in terms of who's being notified, what information is being shared, what information isn't being shared, right? The fact that we don't even have a complete list of the projects that advance to the second stage that receive that encouragement notification from the DOE, let alone have any substantive details about where they're going to be, what infrastructure is involved, what kind of hydrogen they're producing, which entities are involved, what is their track record in these communities, who's being talked to, what is the community benefit, how is EJ factoring into this, right? I'd love to see a concept paper, and so again, an example of how this program is designed to benefit the applicant, not the people impacted directly by these projects. And I also want to highlight this line from the Department of Energy alongside this funding opportunity announcement also released guidance for applicants and prospective applicants in terms of how they might want to go about community benefits and particularly developing the required community benefits plan. Acknowledging that there's a differential experience with engaging with community and stakeholders and so on. And so this is a line from that statement, right? And they do talk about that. Yes, this is valuable in itself, but also it's really important for this reason. And this is also something that David Crane, the head of the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration, reinforced on the applicant webinar. So I'm trying to find the quote where he said, from the DOE's perspective, to do so, to engage in community engagement, to pursue this community benefits plan, materially de-risk the project timetable from delay due to state or local opposition, adding that the last thing we want to see at the DOE is $1 billion of our precious hydrogen hub capital not deployed because an otherwise worthy project ran into entrenched opposition from local communities. And maybe I should have put that quote up there because I think it's, to me, is really the headline in terms of the DOE's posture towards community. But I think there's something really insidious about that statement that I think is worth exploring, in that, like, to me, the assumption is that, the reason people are upset about these projects is that you just didn't simply engage them, right? You didn't talk to them, you didn't talk about them, let them know that this was happening, right? The assumption is that, there are actually no substantive concerns being raised. The fact is just simply lack of communication, right? If only these community members understood more, right? Which to me, I think is a little bit of a paternalistic posture, right? We would see less of this opposition. And, to me, in my experience, in the state and in the region, right? I think a lot of these community members are very familiar with the impacts of, development like this, right? And don't want to see more of it, right? Or have significant questions, or, want to see particular benefits and protections, right? And, the question, and so the expectation should be is, how do we capture that? How do we turn that into, design choices for our program, for, these applications, rather than just thinking, oh, well, the issue is that they just don't know enough, they don't understand, right? And if you just help, close that gap, surely they'll support this project, right? And then, we won't have these delays and pesky, protesters or, whatever this opposition from local communities is. So I thought that was, I think, again, kind of central to how these projects are being administered. A little bit more about the community benefit plan itself. Again, another interesting design choice where this plan accounts for, on one hand, it accounts for 1/5 of the overall score, which I think, by some measures is pretty great. But, for, if you're serious about taking into consideration the interests of community members, of EJ residents, and so on, to me, I think it's something that, it's non-negotiable. It's not something that is just factored in alongside other things, right? To me, it's a threshold point, right? And one way to look at this is that, these applicants can just totally drop the ball on engagement and still, get a pretty strong rating, right? When that shouldn't be the case, because again, it's non-negotiable. Again, just looking at what, these policymakers are saying are the heart of their projects, right? This community engagement, community benefits. Another, thing to be aware of in terms of the design of the funding opportunity announcement, which again kind of guides this regional clean hydrogen hub program, is that the DOE actually requires no firm action from hydrogen hub applicants until after the DOE has made their decisions. And so, I think to me, again, that engagement is suggested, but there's nothing enforceable, right, that is requiring them to actually take these actions, right? And to me, this significantly shrinks the universe of choice that these residents have, right? To understand, to know that these projects are happening in the first place, to understand their impacts, and then have a say in what they look like in the future, right? By the time the DOE is asking for them to be brought in, right? A lot of the substantive decisions have already been made, including, what feedstock is used, to produce this hydrogen, right? Again, kind of just letting it fall to chance, oh, well, there's already gas producing here, or whatever, right? Again, kind of treating this as a natural organic thing that is outside of the purview, of their role, but, as well as infrastructure siting, right? It isn't to say that there won't be, that there are no opportunities in the future, but, I think, to me, I think a lot of the choice has been taken off the table at this point, right? And the fact that we're a year into this and have, again, a handful of slides of information available of these two potentially very impactful projects, I think, is a good example of what this looks like in practice. And then ultimately, I think, to me, I think about who gets to be a stakeholder, right? And so, that funding opportunity announcement does encourage, and this is also reflected in the community benefits plan, encourages, engagement, and bringing in stakeholders from labor and community constituencies into their projects, right? But again, there's something that enforces it, right? And then there's also, I think this is one of the things that was, I think, sort of communicated implicitly on that, the aforementioned, applicant webinar, but, there's nothing in the FOA or the benefits plan that I've seen that I think really, affirmatively addresses this, where, I think one of the issues that we've seen in the region is that it's not that no stakeholders are involved, it's just which stakeholders are at the table, right? Whose perspectives are valued, right? And, I think and so to me, we talk a lot about how, there are these traditional divides between particular groups of the public, right? And, tensions between environmental organizations and labor groups and so on, right? And, rather than, again, kind of apply these affirmative expectations of applicants, right? They're kind of just letting this play out naturally, right? Which is playing out the way it's always played out. And I'll share a little bit more about that later on. Again, little details have been provided. One of the applicants even required NDAs and letters of support before sharing any substantive information about, their hydrogen hub. And again, the decision to be hands-off, to kind of, I will say, like, to their credit, right? At least their stated intent for the design of this plan and, this FOA was to provide applicants with as much flexibility to implement whatever makes sense at the local context, but they did that without any guardrails, right? And so, this is what we did. And, so this is a list of I think they're called the community allies from the ARCH2 project, again, based primarily in West Virginia, but with a larger geographic focus. And I'm not picking on these individual organizations. I just wanted to note that, this is who, the so-called community allies for the ARCH2 project, who their stakeholders are, the people who have, the entities and sectors that have been engaged in the development and design and implementation of their hydrogen hub. And, I think there's 73 of these, and, sorry, I want to get the numbers right. Yeah, so there's 73, community allies overall for this project, and 25 of them are industry and business. 22 are local, state, and federal government. 16 are higher education. 8 labor and workforce, and then 2 are miscellaneous. And I don't want to shortchange some of our colleagues. That includes Clean Air Task Force, who is listed on this website, as well as the Benham Foundation in West Virginia. And so again, just to give you an example of what this, I think, very hands-off, no guardrails approach in terms of community, this is the kind of stakeholder outreach that you get, right? Great, and then I also wanted to just share a little bit more about the hydrogen hub's 4-phased approach. Again, I think, to me, I do want to highlight that, I think this is a good idea. And to me, I wonder if it is a bit of a corrective measure from, the prior DOE demonstration issues that I mentioned. Do want to note that, they do kind of have this 4-phase process, and, there's this kind of like no man's land of pre-application activities that is really just up to the applicants, right? But, the second that an application has been submitted and approved, then the DOE's expectations really kick in. The issue is that, despite, having this, I think, measured 4-phased approach, with checkpoints at each spot to ensure that, development's occurring as intended, that constituencies are being consulted, that, the financing's in place, all that, right? It's intended to take place over 7 to 12 years, but what we're seeing instead is projects in the region are advancing independent of this timeline and well past the planning stage that they should be in, right? Over the next, year and a half. And this is a year and a half from today. This is a year and a half from the opening of this project. This year and a half kicks in when a project has been approved, right? And so there's this whole period of time that needs to be in place for the DOE, I think, intends for, people to be consulted, for, community feedback to shape these projects and so on, right? But, what's happening on the ground doesn't reflect that, right? We have projects that are in the process of securing financing, that are working their way towards permits, and some that intend to be in operations as early as 4 years from now, right? Rather than, waiting for, again, kind of this more measured, I think, more guardrail approach from the DOE, right? And, I will note that, it's possible that some of this is kind of being discussed or deliberated over in the conversations that applicants are having with the people who are reviewing these projects at the DOE, right? But no corrective action has been, publicized. I haven't seen anything that reflects that they're even aware of this program problem, let alone taking it seriously. I think it's like every 2 or 3 weeks we'll see another announcement where these ambitious timelines that they're completely independent of what the DOE intends for these projects. And then, kind of closing this out, I do want to talk a little bit about what is a community benefit and who designs this. So Sean shared the CEQ report on carbon capture permitting. It stated that one of the many things that they encouraged state and local officials to do was to declare carbon capture and storage to be in the public interest, which to me I think kind of achieves 2 things, right? I think like on one hand, it's the rhetorical and legal groundwork, right, for potentially eminent domain to be used in support of these projects. But then the other thing, I think, again, kind of looking past the language, looking past, towards like what's actually happening on the ground, is what we see is the conflation of these projects themselves as a benefit in and of themselves, right? I do want to note that the FOA, the Community Benefits Plan, do ask applicants to assess and minimize and mitigate, negative impacts associated with their projects, right? But I think in this framework, right, the math will always end up that these projects are going to be a good thing, right? And that to me is just such a limited understanding of what a community benefit is, right? And so I just want to bring up, this quote from Edith Abeda, who is a Pittsburgh area resident. This is something she shared at a DOE carbon management meeting last December that I thought really highlights the gap between what residents in the region are saying they need for their communities and what's being kind of offered to them through these projects and from policymakers. And then lastly, environmental justice. So also wanted to highlight a little bit about again how the DOE says it's kind of implementing this. And so you'll note that there are these 8 priorities that outline how the DOE is implementing the Justice 40, or the vision of Justice 40. And there are no associated details that give any criteria or measures for the attainment of these, right? And to me, I look at these and there's so much ambiguity, right? That people who are very supportive of these projects and people who are very opposed to them can use these same principles in service of this argument, or in service of their respective arguments, right? And I also want to highlight that they also reference that that this was based on stakeholder engagement, priorities identified by the WEJAC, and additional research, right? What they failed to mention is that the WEJAC said that explicitly carbon capture and storage, and the procurement of fossil fuels, development, infrastructure repair, et cetera, are examples of projects that will not benefit a community, right? And so there's no discussion, no disclosure of this, right? And seeing such a full-throated endorsement against these projects from this, I think, very prestigious, very important advisory body, right, on EJ to the federal government, and then just no discussion of that, right? To me, I wonder who do they consider a stakeholder in the EJ, right? Do they feel that polluters of EJ communities are commensurate stakeholders of the people living with that pollution? A lot of details I think that are not disclosed here, but I think the distinction between who they cite and what's actually happening in practice, I think, is really important to note. And then, sorry, I do think this is the last one, and this is intentionally a little bit of a wall of text. So this is just this is just what I remember, but this is what a variety of either drafts or feedback opportunities or funding opportunities that have been announced by primarily the DOE, but not exclusively. In the context of this federal decarbonization, strategy, to give you a sense of just the volume of, things that, state officials, legislators, nonprofit advocates, community leaders, and the general public, right? What they have to navigate, right, to understand what's happening. And, in addition to the volume of this, right, there's also no coherent strategy that contextualizes how all of these things fit together, right? There's no, surely there are opportunities to, I think, streamline some of this, right, where feedback on one project can apply to others and so on. And what we get is just this volume, this deluge of, of information, right, and opportunities, and, creating a landscape where people are acted upon rather than seen as agents in their own lives. So I also wanted to highlight this article from Inside Climate News about stakeholder fatigue, right? And where this is something that people are experiencing all over the country, and not even just related to to decarbonization, right? I think there are a lot of federal and state initiatives, right, that I think are overtaxing. I think very, very stretched, under-resourced, community and advocate structures in different regions, right? Industry experts, academics, and so on. But the reason I want to include this quote is that acknowledging that this is something that I think experienced by a variety of stakeholders, it uniquely impacts communities and organizations who either operate in or in service to the issues that impact low-income communities and environmental justice communities, right? Where they don't have the capacity to devote resources to these kinds of things, right? And then when you look at this list, who does, right? And, again, this is only going to get worse as these projects continue, right? Without, again, kind of that intervention from policymakers, again, to have a more proactive, affirmative approach to what these projects need to look like and how it's going to be communicated to the public. And so 2 quick examples. I don't want to spend too much time talking about Shell, but I did want to highlight a little bit about kind of the, just the selectively passive way in which Pennsylvania has been approaching, this development. And so highlighting, again, just to editorialize a little bit, I just don't know in what universe, Shell is seen as the anchor for this, regional economic plan, right? As well as, one of the region's strongest efforts to fight climate change. And so I wanted to highlight, some of the, prior issues involved with the operations of that plant, and also, how state leaders are approaching this, right? With the acting Secretary Nguyen saying that, we know that Shell can operate a state-of-the-art facility that helps grow our economy without harming the environment. And this is from the press release where, Shell had to pay $10 million in air quality, in response to their air quality violations, right? This is the approach that we're seeing from policymakers, right? Again, we're kind of seeing these things, the assumption that, these again are, factors in the natural environment and things that are just wholly outside of our control, right? When that is obviously not the case. And so, 2 more examples of this, and I do want to note that, just highlight that we are talking about 2 different administrations here, right? But, again, the aforementioned $1 billion tax credit for hydrogen, right? And then, and then just months later, the Secretary of the DEP saying that, the department has a very limited role in terms of submission setting it up, and that their role is really going to be in permitting, right? Through those details, that's where they're going to be protecting the environment, right? Completely, forgoing all the other opportunities up to that point, right? To help inform and shape the substance of these applications and these concepts, at the start, right? And so again, example of not only, policymakers limiting, the choices available to the public, but limiting their own. Another example of this is, the recent Fidelis project in West Virginia. And again, lots to talk about here, but I thought this was a really good, sort of case study in how, a series of discrete individual decisions, right, can have a pretty significant impact. And unless someone's tracking this, unless someone, there are expectations or guardrails in place, right, this is just seen again as kind of natural development, right? When again, a series of active choices went in to create this environment that has resulted in, projects like the Fidelis hydrogen production and carbon storage project. So earlier in the year, we had Governor Justice sign a bill that authorized DNR to lease pore space under state forests and wildlife management areas. I do want to note that they did exclude, state parks from that, but there is a measure or provision that allows them to do that with legislative approval. So I just wanted to add that little bit of nuance here. And even the way that particular bill was passed, I thought was really interesting, where this was passed, I think, alongside a dozen other bills, including another pore space or carbon storage bill. The Senate, I think, passed this with unanimous, passed all 25 of these bills with unanimous support, hours before the legislative text was even available to the public, right? And then, I guess, taking kind of a step back, I also want to mention that in December, there was a presentation from the ARCH2 representatives to state officials where, among other things, they identified Pennsylvania's tax credit as a significant barrier to the development of their own hub, right? And so just a few weeks later, we see this, right? Facilitating the process of leasing pore space under public lands. And then, shortly after that, we also have, officials pass a bill that allows, for pretty significant size projects, right? Again, projects that do have some guardrails, right? Like the drop and load ratio, and there's a really great article in the Charleston Gazette Mail from Mike Toney that talks about the projects that have been funded by this. If y'all haven't seen that, y'all should check it out. But wanted to mention that this is, again, another piece of that infrastructure that has kind of resulted in this decision. And then, very recently, August 8th, the Gazette Mail reported that the West Virginia Economic Development Authority is considering a $62.5 million forgivable loan to a company called Fidelis to support their hydrogen production facility and the associated carbon capture site that would utilize pore space primarily on public lands. Nowhere had this project ever been disclosed to the public, and certainly not information regarding the loan or the fact that a loan even existed, right? And then, you know, this article came out, I think, the night before, the evening before, you know, the EDA was gonna be taking this decision up at their meeting, right? And then a few hours before that vote was set to occur, they abruptly canceled it, no information to the public, very little notice, rescheduled it for the following week. And, you know, I will say that, you know, I guess I'll just leave it at that, but the other thing, you know, I attended that meeting virtually, and, you know, the way that happened is the EDA, you know, went into an executive session, deliberated for about 20-25 minutes, came back to several statements of opposition from local residents, community members, and advocates during the scheduled public participation session, and then voted to approve that loan, right? And so again, just a series of discrete, an accumulation of decisions, right, that have a very real, you know, very clear impact, right? And, you know, I think the issue for me is that, like, again, you know, we're seeing this inaction or this passive approach that is, again, kind of recasting this environment as just natural, as it's just happening, opening it up to chance, right? And, you know, but we're hearing that they have these goals of, like, community benefits, we want clean hydrogen, you know, mitigation of climate, and so on. And, you know, we're seeing, I think, a lot of indicators that the outcomes are to the contrary, right? And, you know, and I think the point of my presentation is I just want to highlight that, like, there's a significant gap between what we're seeing come out of these programs and the way it's being implemented, and the policy and political landscape in which it's being implemented, and, like, the very explicit goals, right, from our federal and state policymakers. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there. Happy to take any questions or.
Do you have any sense between the two hydrogen hub projects that you highlighted? And I think there's a third that I don't know anything about, but do you have a sense of which one is more likely to win the funding? And then will the one that doesn't win the funding still roll out? As you said, there's some projects that are rolling out anyway.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have said it's kind of a toss-up. This is speculation, this is kind of my own read, but, like, sorry, I'm, like, struggling to, like, I want to get back to I just, you know, I gotta say that, like, you know, early on, again, it was kind of a toss-up, like, what, you know, kind of the differential advantage or the competitive advantage between your projects, but just seeing how ARCH2 is developed, right? Like, there are a lot of things, you know, on one hand, DNA, very targeted, right? You know, I think kind of a more, like, reluctant to say measured, but a smaller geographic footprint, a smaller number of, you know, targeted end uses involved. You know, but at the same time, you can look at, you know, ARCH2's, like, I think, very different approach, right? Much more expansive, larger number of people involved is also a benefit, right? Where they're like, we have so many people at the table, we have so many states committed to this, right? And, you know, I gotta say, most of that's pretty risky stuff, just based on Sean's, you know, presentation, right? But that's also a way they can say, like, oh, we're spreading out the risk among a variety of projects, right? And so I don't know, so I think to me, like, just seeing, again, kind of the volume of projects and people involved, and then also just how I think ARCH2 is really, I think, talked about their project and the narrative around their project. Like, I feel like maybe there's a slight advantage there, but it's really hard to tell. I don't know, I feel like, you know, we could see, you know, either or both. We could see, you know, approved, we could see, you know, the project consolidated, we can see both of them rejected, right? I wish I could tell you, I think I'm reading the same tea leaves you are. But to the second question, you know, I do think that there are, you know, there is already kind of that regulatory infrastructure in place and more to come, and then also that financial investment. But to me, it leads me to believe that regardless of the DOE's funding decisions, I do think states are going to be committed to pursuing this. Maybe not to the extent that they would without this funding, maybe not, I don't know, but you know, they're making the same moves regardless, right? You know, like that tax credit will still apply, you know, Fidelis will have this loan and so on.
So when are we expecting this DOE announcement then?
Yeah, great question. And this is a good, so there's like a lot of kind of glossed over, but this is a good example of kind of the DOE setting expectations and for who. You know, they've shared that, like, sometime in the fall or the end of this year, they will be making their announcements and will begin the negotiation awards with applicants. Nowhere in that statement do they say this is when we'll tell the public and this is what we'll tell the public at that time. And so maybe we will hear. I do think think that, Secretary Granholm has, I think, stated several times that she does want to see, them, beat that deadline, right? And, I think they would have loved to be at that place 2 months ago, right? That clearly didn't happen. I guess like it's, we're supposed to hear it this year. I just don't know when it's gonna be publicized and what they're gonna share, right?
So whenever they do announce this, it will be, that they'll say which projects are going to be supported by federal money and how much, is that the idea?
I think so, and then some cursory
No.
information and.
Pardon?
I wasn't gonna cover this in my presentation next, but we don't know what they're gonna say. There could be a press release that says we're gonna give X, hydrogen hub $500 million for green and blue hydrogen projects. There's no obligation for them to tell anything, and they don't wanna tell anything, because it's just gonna generate opposition to their plans.
Yeah, I will say, David's right in that there is nothing that explicitly says, again, when they're gonna say and what they're gonna say, but, my answer comes from how the DOE has rolled out other funding decisions, right, where they do share. And then again, there are a number of choices here. They could just choose to delay this. I think there's a lot of changes they should make to this program, right, that I think will get them closer to the outcomes and, to a truer sense of community benefits. But, they can also, decline to fund, set aside part of the money for later on, right? So there are a number of choices, but based on how they've kind of rolled out other funding opportunities, they do typically share which projects, what states they're in, how much money they got. Sometimes that includes, a matching, right? It'll say how much the state or the operator matched, and then a few sentences, a paragraph or two about what that project entails. But they could also just choose not to do that too, right? So yeah, speculation.
Yeah.
Did you have another question? Okay, James?
Well, I don't know if you've heard anything about if NEPA and how NEPA is gonna apply to this federal money, because the website initially said there would be a NEPA process, DOE's website. I just don't know when and where that will happen. NEPA, if that does apply, and when it does apply, we should get details at that point, because that requires like a hard look at all the environmental impacts from the decision to give federal money to a big project. And so that should require them to publicize information, because there's supposed to be a public comment process. But there's some, I know, just like legal wonks stuff, there's some argument that this money might not have to comply with NEPA, even though they said it would. So I don't know what they're doing with that. They didn't answer my question when I asked that before. I don't know if you've heard anything. That was way back when we first moved to Torres.
Well, any other questions? Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there a hub that was applying out of Philly?
Yeah, there's two, there's like one, like a little, I'm not
Which
not
would
gonna
make
embarrass.
more sense from an end user standpoint. I mean, you're right on the eastern seaboard, whereas in
It
Kentucky,
does,
it's like.
and so, yeah, this is the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub. There's like another one that's like,
Okay.
there's like a, kind of adjacent to it that always mix up a little bit. I do think that it obviously it's happening in a different like political and economic context, and so that does change, I think, the prospective customers available to them. I think one of the disadvantages of that is like, where are they gonna store the carbon, right? Because from what I read, they are billing it as like a clean, green hydrogen hub, right? But from the information that has been made available to me, natural gas is gonna be the primary feedstock, and that makes sense based on who's involved with that project. I have also heard that they are changing that, or they've received feedback, that has encouraged them to change that, and so maybe that changes it a little bit, but if they are still committed to the fossil fuel-based hydrogen, I think where they would store it, right, I think would be a significant challenge, and you'd run into that problem that Sean talked about, where, they'd have to, transport somewhere, probably with pipelines, somewhere where they need to store it, where they can store it, like.
You probably are thinking they have a better chance of getting funding, because there have to be two in natural gas areas,
Yeah.
because of the way the bill was written.
Yeah.
The follow-up is,
Sorry, real quick, Sean, Tom, did you have?
Yeah,
more
I
feedback
did,
on that?
I have participated in a couple of conversations with like the city office of sustainability and some of the terms in that application. And to confirm, they have removed the blue hydrogen components based on feedback, so they're not gonna necessarily have to transport a lot of CO2. They're still talking about some orange hydrogen, I think they call it, so there's a new color, right? If you're capturing carbon from renewable methane, which it seems like even more of a boondoggle to me, but I think that's gonna be a very small component. I think that primarily they're looking at green hydrogen from the eventual build out of offshore wind, and pink hydrogen from the Limerick nuclear plant, and possibly nuclear plants in New Jersey. And they, in terms of off-takers, it is a rather shotgun approach to off-takers. Everyone from like SEPTA and the Delaware Area Transit Authority for buses to there's a chemical company that is looking at making green ammonia for maritime transport. But I think it sounds like that's the biggest concern too, is where's the demand gonna be? They're saying they're not gonna use it for building heating.
That's surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. And so to the question in the back, the Pennsylvania state government is also supporting that application as well as the DNA.
What do you consider the options if, for both Arch 2 and DNA, and then also Philadelphia, and then there's one up in the Great Lakes that's sort of Cleveland area, that runs into here. What are your thoughts about it if there aren't, so if there's now, a jump from 7 projects to 10 projects that are being funded, that still leaves 20 something off the table, right, that we know of, that wouldn't get funded? What do you think of the chances of say either of these two being funded, or going through, especially the DNA one, which doesn't seem to have as much commercial commitment as Arch 2?
Yeah, before I put it to Sean, I do want to note that Rystad Energy, I think, ranked Arch 2 as one of the top 4 hubs that they expect will get funding. So so I think there's a lot of reasons why people would think that, right? And something that I didn't spend a lot of time on, but is also just recognizing the political element of it, right? And the support from Senator Manchin, and just what the role of, I think, this region and projects like this play in kind of the national conversation about the success of the administration and all that. But Sean, I'd love to hear what you think to that.
I just can't imagine the fury of the announcements being made and the region, probably in the form of Arch 2, not getting a designation, and how Joe Manchin will react to that. I'd like to see it.
But Pennsylvania has more electoral votes, right? So
That's why I think Mach 2 is gonna get one and Arch 2 is gonna get one.
Because
I was only going to add, and Tom just alluded to it, that Rystad, Southern Company, they came out about, I think, 4 weeks ago with their assessment, their ranking of the top 10, and they ranked their top 10 based on they tried to match the criteria that had been articulated by DOE with the characteristics, the known characteristics of the given proposals. And so in that one, I think, as Tom said, it was, Arch 2 came out ranked number 4. DNA and Mach 2 did not make the top 10 list.
Because it seems to me what they told me is that they're trying at Arch 2 at least to not grab money so much as make the commercial commitment, so it's a smaller percentage of federal funding that would be needed for Arch 2 compared to other projects. That's sort of their.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's tactically, I think it's a smart thing to do, though.
It is what's happening too. I think that was one of the things that really surprised me about this, is just looking at even the cost of this facility, right? Could take the DOE match on its own, right? And they're pursuing 15 of these, right? And I don't have the number on top of me, but there is an estimate for how, if the Arch 2 application is funded, what portion of that funding would go to the Fidelis project. I don't have it on top of me, but they are intended to kind of spread that out, and I think there is a logic to that, sure.
I'm got no inside information, but if I were advising Biden, I give money to every one of the 26 that's remaining on the list. Just prioritize who gets the most and do it like that. I mean, clearly, Mansion's is gonna have major influence on the funding of projects. They don't want him running off to be a third-party candidate. You know, Democratic states, Democratic governors will get a fair amount, but I think they'll try to fund as many as they can.
I have a question, like, it seems like clear they're gonna give some money out through the bipartisan infrastructure law. But like, what happens if they give money out, they start these projects, and then the companies themselves are like, nah, I don't wanna do this. On second thought, I don't know, what, you're shaking your head.
It's been.
They don't have to return anything.
But I mean, like, right, you
Well-
spend the money on a bunch of studies and you started building and remediating a brownfield site for your new hydrogen facility, but then the investors are like, no, we don't wanna go down this road.
Yeah, I think first there's, you know, I do wanna, like, to their credit, highlight some of the guardrails or how some of these protections have been kind of ingrained in these decisions. So, you know, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the Fidelis loan itself. I'm happy to share more about that. But, like, you know, there are some measures in that, you know, in that financing decision where, you know, they have to meet certain, like, construction requirements. You have to apply for and receive permits on particular timelines. They also have to, like, have a certain amount of jobs by a certain particular period of time, of jobs of a particular quality, and any jobs that they fail to meet, right, they have to kind of pay back a prorated amount. So that is happening there, right? And, you know, the Pennsylvania tax credit, right, is, you know, it's based on the hydrogen being produced, right? So if it's not being produced, right, maybe there's less risk there. And then, you know, then we do have this, you know, the four-phase approach where, you know, they are kind of spreading out how much money they're giving out to projects, right, over time, right? And so there's like a much clearer, like, definition of this in the FOA that I think is worth spending some time on. But, you know, part of it is, like, I think to kind of have this staggered approach to ensure that certain benchmarks are being met in between these kind of interim checkpoints, right? But I think the bigger question is, like, you know, there are other kinds of sunk costs here, right? And to me, I think a lot of it's like rhetorical and ideological, right? Where we're seeing, you know, the kinds of development that's being supported, right? And, you know, this to me, like, takes up space from the alternatives, right? That we need to be exploring right now if we're trying to decarbonize our economy, right? And, you know, turn things around in the region. So I guess I also want to mention that kind of more, like, abstract sunk costs, because I do think the distraction is substantive.
Well, I mean, another dynamic, and I'm really glad you brought this up, Reed, is that, as I mentioned when I was talking earlier, the vast bulk of the money, as you just suggested, has to come from markets. This is really seed money to the degree it exists at all. And one of the challenges that's faced by these projects, particularly with the money coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, is that those tax credits, the revenue from those tax credits isn't realized until the carbon is actually captured. And of course, these are all, for the most part, very capital intensive enterprises. That means they have to have the money up front. They only recapture it over time. That puts more weight on the private side of this. And we've actually seen this scenario you just described played out at least once, and I'm thinking specifically of the PTT proposed cracker for Belmont County, Ohio, which received, in total, it was a series of grants, but it received a total of $70 million from Jobs Ohio, of which they ended up giving back $20 million.
Right, cause they like cleared the land or something.
Yeah.
So they spent money on that, but they never, so, sorry to be asking so many questions, but what happens, let's say, in 5 years if through some act of the deity, there is a carbon price in the United States? Does that change the economics?
Yes, it does, and it varies somewhat by industry, and it changes it based on, are there alternatives? And so, for instance, in the electricity sector, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference, and the reason is you always have the option of renewable resources out there, along with storage and other things out there. But in industries where, I mean, right now, the problem is, and they have not dealt with this legislatively yet, you can subsidize hydrogen and you can subsidize carbon capture, but unless you recover as a recipient of those subsidies, not just the cost of doing it, but you also recover an adequate return on investment, it's still not worth it because you have competitors out there who aren't gonna do it, who are just gonna keep producing gray hydrogen, who are just gonna continue doing unabated emissions in their operations. And so unless you recover not only the cost of it, but also a profit on implementing blue hydrogen or carbon capture, then you're putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage. And that only gets fixed if there is basically a tax in some form, carbon fee in some form or another down the road. And of course, that's a prospect that no politician wants to own up to right now. And there's even a cliff here as well, because you have to consider that the IRA subsidies for hydrogen, I believe it's 10 years. For carbon capture, it's 12 years for those tax credits to be in existence. After that, they end. And the question is, given that you're going to significantly increase the cost of operations, for instance, to operate carbon capture, what do you do if you've retrofitted your plant the day those subsidies end 12 years from now, or 12 years from when you start? The economically rational thing to do is to just turn the damn stuff off and go back to running the way you used to.